Okay, so welcome everybody to the ArgLab Research Colloquium, the permanent seminar of the Reasoning and Argumentation Lab at the University of Lisbon. So before I start, let me remind you again that this session is recorded and is broadcast live on Facebook. So if you would rather not be visible, you can turn off your video now. This is the 5th session of the season. We continue with one session per month, online for the time being, and the full schedule can be found at our website. Our guest today is SteveOswald from the University of Fribourg in Switzerland. Steve is senior lecturer of English in the English department at the University of Fribourg, and also a lecturer at the Institute of English Studies at the University in Neuchâtel. His research is at the interface of several disciplines, pragmatics, argumentation theory, cognitive science, and discourse analysis. And he has a valuable contribution to the study of various topics, including deception and cooperative communication, cognitive aspects of fallacious argumentation, on commitment in linguistics and pragmatics, on the persuasiveness of conspiracy theories, as well as on humor. And those of you who know Steve know they can always count on that, no matter how serious the talk is. Today, he will be telling us more about pragmatics and argumentation, theoretical and experimental considerations. It's a great pleasure to have you here with us, Steve. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Dima. Thank you very much, Maria Grazia, for the invitation. Really happy to be here, although I'm not here, but you know, it's nice to see familiar faces and to get the chance to talk about stuff that I'm really interested in. Because this is actually part of a long-term project of mine. I have 2 goals in this talk. First, I'm going to survey available interfaces between pragmatic and argumentative scholarship. And I realized when I was thinking about this talk that this is actually what I've been doing ever since my first publication in 2007, which was an attempted interface between pragmatic dialectics and relevance theory. It's still a work in progress because although I've thought about these issues for a few years, it's only this year that I'm really focusing on them. So what you are about to see is a collection of various studies in argumentation that take pragmatic input. It might look a bit like a photo album, I'm sorry about that, but let's see how it goes. And also I will probably forget some approaches, some people. So if you are among those, please do not feel offended. I cannot, put everyone in 45 minutes. By the way, a bit of promotion. Many of you are aware of this, but I'm putting together a special issue on precisely this topic. And I'm happy to talk about it afterwards, but just so you know, there's a special issue on pragmatics and argumentation that is supposed to come out probably next year. All right, the second goal of my talk is to reflect on the current and future directions of research to keep milking this particular interface between pragmatics and argumentation, because it has offered a lot and it still has a lot to offer. That's what I'm going to try to do to show you in the second part of my talk, notably by looking at experimental possibilities at this interface. I have structured this talk in terms of the typical research questions that argumentation studies seeks to answer. So there's a descriptive issue in argumentation theory, which has to do with describing what argumentation is. And in that realm or subfield of argumentation studies, we study definitions of argumentation, structures of argumentation, types, resources, and so on. The second part will be about normative issues, because argumentation theorists are typically concerned not only with what argumentation is, but with when argumentation is good or bad. And I'm using good because I don't want to take a normative strong stance here. So you put in good whatever you want. You put validity if you're a formal logician, you put soundness or cogency if you're an informal logician, reasonableness if you're a pragmatician, and so on. So in that study, in that area of study, argumentation theorists are busy with finding out the norms which offer evaluative standards for the quality of argumentation. I just had a message in the chat that someone cannot read the slides. Can everyone read the slides?
I can read them.
Okay.
Sorry, it must be my connection. I'm trying to, because I see the video is fine. Sorry for the interruption.
No problem.
I'll try to, sorry.
Okay. And the third question, the third set of issues is a set of explanatory issues. So why and under which conditions is argumentation effective? And in that sub-area of research and argumentation theory, typically rhetoricians have been trying to explain why some arguments are likely to persuade or not, and are likely to have some sort of rhetorical effect. So what I want to do is basically show you that pragmatics can be infused in all three questions. So I'm going to start with the descriptive issues, but before that, just a second, a few seconds. Why pragmatics? Why would pragmatics be useful for argumentation? Well, these two guys seem to have figured it out. So that's Franz van Emeren and Rob Grotendorst, authors of Dialectics, and they say the following in their 1984 book. In our view, it's first necessary to develop a theoretical conception of the use of language in discussions, which is basically what pragmatics does. And this is based on the assumption that argumentative discussions are discussions of a particular kind that exploit language and communication possibilities that are afforded to us as humans, such that it becomes possible to establish what are the principal problems that are likely to present themselves in resolving disputes, so that's the argumentative part, and how they may be solved. And in their words, the speech act theory is the best analytical instrument so far developed in descriptive interpretive pragmatics. So argument from authority, why pragmatics? Because they say so. But there are also substantial reasons, not just taking their word for it. First of all, is that pragmatics and argumentation do overlap in many respects, but one crucial respect is that both of them are busy with inference. So pragmatics is typically the study of meaning inferences, how people understand what others are saying. And argumentation theory is typically busy with studying justificatory inferences. Okay, so inferences that are of a supportive evidence-giving kind. And I've discussed this in some previous work, but if you think about those two types of inferences, it makes sense to consider that the output of pragmatic inference, so that is comprehension, what you understand from a message, is necessary and it's taken as input for the argumentative inference. You need to understand what a speaker is saying before you can judge whether the conclusion follows from the premises that they have put forward. And if you look at seminal work in pragmatics, you will see that there's a lot of room for argumentation in there. To take speech act theory, I'm going to elaborate on this afterwards, but Austin, in his William James lectures, he talked about persuading and convincing as perlocutionary acts. And actually, his first example of perlocution is persuasion. And then he says, we can similarly distinguish the locutionary act, he said that, from the illocutionary act, he argued that, and the perlocutionary act, he convinced me that. So in Austin's seminal work in speech act theory, you already have room that has been reserved to talk about argumentation. And this is the same for Grice, who had something along the lines of perlocution in mind. When he worked on his framework, he said that he stated his maxims as if the purpose were a maximally effective exchange of information. And he adds, this specification is of course too narrow and the scheme needs to be generalized to allow for such general purposes as influencing or directing the actions of others. And there, I think you can have lots of room to discuss the typical effects of argumentation. All right, before I embark on these questions, I'm just going to very quickly try to give you the gist of 4 pragmatic frameworks. I limited myself to the inferential and the speech act theoretical traditions to show you that how these then are exploited by argumentation and have been exploited by argumentation research. So the first is, of course, speech act theory, famously elaborated by John Langshaw Austin in his William James lectures, and then picked on also by John Searle. The main assumption behind this paradigm is that language is action, and that has a number of advantages that are very useful for argumentation theorists. First of all, saying is doing means that you can conceptualize I guess bring some descriptive and explanatory power to the idea that communication is purposeful and multifaceted. You do many things when you communicate. Second, this account makes it possible to specify felicity conditions for all successful speech acts. And that's a very interesting descriptive advantage, because then you can point the differences between different types of acts and under which condition they are successful. And also, it opens up an area of inquiry about norms of interaction, also beyond conversational norms. I'll go back to this, and this is a normative advantage. At the core of the theory, and I think that one of the aspects that's been also most influential in argumentation theory, is the difference between illocutionary acts and perlocutionary acts. Illocutionary ones have to do with comprehension, and perlocutionary acts have to do with the consequences of comprehension. Okay, notably on the audience. The second framework is one of my personal favorites, Grice's framework. With his paper Logic and Conversation, he opened up a huge area of research, not only in pragmatics, but you'll see in, well, in argumentation theory. His main idea was that talk exchanges are principled. And so he was interested in pretty much finding out which principles apply to conversations so that conversations are properly held. So in the same way that in linguistics you have syntax that accounts for grammatical utterances, Grice thought that pragmatic principles can account for rational communication. And he, in his account, he kind of gives us not really a recipe, but a way of understanding communication as a rational endeavor. He does that by postulating that communication is a cooperative endeavor, and that we observe or exploit certain principles, conversational maxims, in order to convey meaning and to ensure a maximally effective exchange of information. Now, on Grice's account, successful conversation is purposeful. It involves, and this is crucial, appropriate identification of the speaker's communicative intentions, and it's inferential. That is, you do not decode speaker meaning, you work it out by using context and, according to Grice's model, by using some principles of communication. The third model is relevance theory, a cognitive theory of human communication elaborated in the 80s and 90s by Dan Sperber and Deirdre Wilson. They also take the Gricean heritage and they construe communication as ostensive inferential, but they do not believe that it's regulated by principles, by pragmatic principles. Instead, they think that the way we communicate is highly dependent on the way our brains work. And for them, our brains are equipped to look for the relevance of information or stimuli that we deem that are directed to us. And at the same time, when we produce utterances, we produce them so that people recognize that they're relevant. Interestingly, they have a technical definition of what relevance is, and that's an optimal ratio between processing effort and cognitive effect. And you will see that this particular construal of relevance is very useful in argumentation theory. I'll give you a couple of examples afterwards. In a nutshell, this theory supplies a model of information processing and of information selection. And when you think about processes like persuasion, when what happens is in the end that one part at least of the content of the message of the speaker ends up being part of an addressee's cognitive environment, it means that the information that was passed on was retained, was selected. And there are ways of conceptualizing under which conditions that information is selected. So that allows us to make sense how people, how people make sense of communicative stimuli, but also, and crucially, to study the constraints that can affect it. Moreover, because it's a framework that is grounded in cognitive science, it lays empirically testable claims as to how our mind works, and in communicative context and settings in particular. So that opens up and frees up the space for experimental research. And finally, it does provide a robust framework to study communicative effects. They haven't looked at a lot of perlocutionary effects except comprehension, which for them is a perlocutionary effect of communication. But I think that it can fairly well be extended beyond that. Finally, the last framework that is very common in pragmatic research and that has been used by argumentation scholars is conversational analysis. Here, I'm taking the seminal works of Harvey Sachs, Emanuel Shegloff, and Gail Jefferson, for whom doing pragmatics is to be construed as a subfield of doing sociology. They focus on how people behave in interaction, pretty much in the same way as speech act theory, because they also see communication as the performance of certain actions. And they're mainly busy with describing stable interactional practices. They have done a lot of work in identifying different interactive routines that we engage in regular day-to-day interactions, be they greeting, performing requests, giving advice, talking in professional settings, and so on. And so they're really interested in accounting for the normative organization of interactions. When we talk, we just don't do things randomly. There are sequences of preferred sequences by which we do things. So it's a highly observational discipline that has identified a number of dimensions of analysis that are very interesting, such as turn taking, the way people manage the floor in conversations, repair, that is the consequences of certain initiating sequences, action formation and ascription, and action sequencing. This is an approach that has a very strong methodological focus. They are credited with inventing and coming up with very rigorous ways of transcribing data, because they worked a lot of oral data, spoken data, or recordings. And so they came up with very now widespread transcription protocols. Their outlook on pragmatic research is inductive. For the most part, your analysis has to be informed by what you see. And so the categories and the classifications, they emerge from your observation of the data. And in the end, they try to identify patterns of interaction. And you can see how applied to argumentation, this could be very interesting in descriptive terms. All right, now that we have this background, I'm sorry if this was a repeat for all of you. I just wanted to be a bit more, a bit complete, just so we're on the same page. So yeah, pragmatics can be used and has been used to describe argumentation. So I'm going to give you 7 examples of argumentative research that has drawn on pragmatic research. So starting with Pragmatic dialectics, which defines argumentation as an illocutionary act made of several speech acts. So for pragmaticians, argumentation can be treated as an illocutionary act complex that is composed of elementary illocutions, which belong to the category of assertives. And the total constellation of these elementary illocutions constitutes the illocutionary act complex of argumentation. So they harness the architecture of speech act theory to apply it to a phenomenon that speech act theory hadn't discussed in detail, which is argumentation. And they have to adapt it to make it account in a descriptively adequate way for what we observe in argumentative communication. This speech act of argumentation has specific features. It involves at least 2 statements. In the words of Toulmin, that would be the datum and warrant, or basically 2 premises. It has 2 simultaneous illocutionary forces, that is assertion and argumentation, and it cannot stand on its own, and it's functionally related to another sentence, the standpoint, the claim, through a relationship of justification. Now, this is the very summarized view, but I just wanted to show you that the actual definition of argumentation is phrased in speech act theoretic terms. So here we have an example of speech act theory acting as a theoretical foundation of argumentation theory in this example. This is also the case of Lilian Bermejo Luque's model of called the linguistic normative model of argumentation. She's also very much concerned with the normative aspects of speech act theory, but for her, arguing is also to be construed as a speech act. In fact, a second order speech act complex that consists in adducing a reason and concluding a target claim. Notice that she includes the whole process from argumentation from the premises to the standpoint, whereas in the pragmatic dialectical discussion, it was only focused on the argument. Both of these speech acts are performed usually through a first order constitutive speech act. And interestingly, she defines argumentation as the practice by which you express relationships of justification, and that is governed by normative standards which amount to constitutive correctness conditions. So arguing successfully in that theory amounts to showing that you have met the correctness conditions of the speech act of arguing. Okay. Again, this is an example that speech act theory functions as a theoretical foundation of something you can say about arguments within argumentation theory. Moving on to Sally Jackson and Scott Jacobs' model of conversational arguments. So although they also draw on speech act theory, they actually implement what we saw with conversational analysis in their own model, because they adopt a procedural view of argumentation as a public practice meant to generate agreement. This is what they say: arguments are functionally defined as interactionally emergent structures which are organized around the function of managing disagreement. So argumentation here is really taken as a sequence of speech acts that can be described in structural, functional, but also rational terms. In structural terms, they define it as a disagreement relevant expansion. That is, argumentations are structured in a way that they implement a disagreement, a discussion about some form of disagreement. And at the rational level, this accounts for how all components of argumentation relate to each other based on their ability to fulfill certain goals that are pertinent to the management of disagreement in conversation. So not only is this defining argumentation as a way of doing things, but it's also defined as a specific way of doing things in a specifically structured way with specific functions that account for some rational goals that you have, that allow you to attain some rational goals that you have. So again, here you see that not only speech act theory, but conversation analysis is harnessed to provide a theoretical foundation of how you describe argumentation practices. Okay, moving away from the speech act theory perspective and moving towards the Gricean perspective. You might know that, of course, Grice's formulation of the cooperative principle is vague. This is what he says. He says, make your contribution such as is required at the stage at which it occurs by the accepted purpose or direction of the talk exchange in which you're engaged. And which basically means, if you paraphrase it, do as you're expected, right? Because the accepted purpose or direction of the talk exchange could be anything. So by this definition, if the point of our discussion is to curse each other out and insult us, if I do that, and if you do that, we're cooperating. Yeah. Now, interestingly as well, cooperation is a salient notion for Grice's commentators, but not so much for Grice himself. He didn't even make a special indentation in his paper to formulate the cooperative principle. It's just part of a sentence. And he was actually more interested in rational communication more than cooperation proper. Yeah. Nevertheless, it is there, but I think that people in pragmatics actually have overplayed the role that cooperation had in Grice, because his level of cooperation is quite minimal, in the sense that in his paper at least, cooperation is meant to regulate the way people understand each other, not necessarily whether they're helpful with each other, whether they pursue the same objectives, but just on the comprehension level. For Grice, there's a minimal amount of cooperation. Now, this has been extended. So if you look at humor theory, you get, for instance, people like one of the founding fathers of the discipline, Victor Raskin, who came up with a non-bona fide, bona fide principle of cooperation that applies to humorous exchanges. In politeness theory, you also have some form of cooperation for politeness that has been promoted. And in argumentation theory, you also have some of that. So if you look at the work of Trudy Gauvier, which was re-edited recently in 2018 in Windsor, when she talks about charity and the principle of charity and how we should analyze argumentation and react to argumentation when we try to figure out what people mean and what they're trying to do as they argue, she says the principle of charity will direct the audience to interpret an arguer's discourse in a way that will conform to the purpose of arguing and considering arguments. So here, that will conform to the purpose of arguing and considering arguments is a specific instantiation of what we have in Grice's cooperative principle, right? Van Emeren and Grotendorst, together with Jackson and Jacobs, in their 93 book, they take a similar line, because they construe the purpose of argumentative discussions as resolving a difference of opinion. And therefore, if you produce speech acts which are instrumental to that goal, then you are cooperating in the argumentation game. Yeah. Something similar claim is made in Walton's New Dialectic from '98, in which the purpose of every dialogue has to be identified in order to judge the cooperativeness, and then to give a normative standard. I'll discuss that afterwards, for each contribution in that type of dialogue. So here you see how Grice's framework can be used as a theoretical foundation of argumentation theory, because it gives you a framework to think of argumentation as a cooperative activity towards a certain purpose, which is sometimes resolving a difference of opinion, but it could be something else. Another area of research in argumentation theory where Grice's influence is very noticeable is the work on presumptions. So the reason why this is the case is that Grice's framework offers an inferential account of intention recognition based on conversational principles and context. And the important bit here is conversational principles. And so I'm referring here to Jean's paper in 2001, where she notes that Grice's model is very idealistic, and as such is not very well suited to account for competitive or in cooperative interactions, such as the ones you can find in a courtroom, in courtroom interaction, for instance. So because of that, I mean, we don't have it to throw it away with the baby's water, the bath water, or if Grice is the baby, down the drain, but we have to adapt it. That's the idea. So the inferential basis of the model allows us to develop a model of presumptions, which corresponds to certain expectations that we have about an agent's behavior, depending on contextual norms, and which can be met or satisfied or not in argumentative interactions. And here you have, of course, the work of Fred Kaufeld and also Andrei Moldovan that discusses really the import of Gricean theory for an account of presumptions in argumentation. So while conversation maxims cover presumptions about cooperative exchanges in terms of comprehension, they fail to account for more, and we would want that. So Grice's account should be refined to be attuned to argumentative purposes. And that way, research on commitments, presumptions, and dialectical expectations at play in argumentative practices can proceed. Fabrizio, I didn't include your work here because it's featured somewhere else, so please be patient with me. So you see how the Grayson framework, again, can act as a theoretical foundation of argumentation theory within a given area of research around presumptions, commitments, and expectations in argumentative dialogues. Then rhetoricians were also drawing from pragmatics, and this is a very natural fit, actually. So I'm thinking here of the work of Marcelo Dascal and D. Gross, I don't remember his first name, sorry, Daniel David, on rhetorical transactions. And what they do basically is an integration between pragmatics and rhetoric by giving a cognitive reading of Aristotelian rhetoric and giving us Grice Aristotle in a way. What basically they do is amend Grice's framework to describe persuasive interactions based on this idea of communicative causality. So the idea that part of you ending up believing something is determined by the fact that you recognize that the speaker actually intends you to believe that thing, okay? And in their paper, they reinterpret the traditional categories of logos, ethos, and pathos as products of inference of a Gricean type. And in that way, they account for audience reactions to persuasion. Another area of inquiry in rhetoric that makes use of pragmatic research is moving Tyndale's use of relevance and relevance theory. Sorry, that was 2-3 years ago now at the kickoff event of the Apply Cost project in Lisbon. So Tyndale uses the relevance theory notion of cognitive environment, which denotes basically the amount of, well, the set of information that is manifest to an individual at any given time, to describe the relevance of argumentation to an audience. So the idea is that with those notions, you can account for lots of things that are relevant from a point of view of persuasion and consideration of what happens with the audience when they receive a message. So you can explain how the relevance of premises may vary from one audience to the next. You can explain also how irrelevance can be actually turned into relevance. He shows that relevance is therefore a degree sensitive notion. And he also voices this interesting idea. I say interesting because I thought I came up with it. And then I read that he had written about it like 20 years before I came up with it. That happened twice with Tyndale. So in the end, I confronted him once in Lisbon and I asked him, Chris, you know what? Every time I have a good idea, you thought of it before, I'm annoyed. And he looked at me and he said, this very nice word, says, well, then this must mean I am your Walton, because apparently he had the same kind of relationship with Doug Walton. Anyway, that interesting idea is that you can use relevance theory to ground judgments in argumentative reconstructions. And I'm going to talk about it afterwards. So here you see that pragmatic frameworks can be used as theoretical foundations of cognitive rhetoric, which is also something I've tried to be advocating for in the past 10 years or so. So finally, what about argumentative reconstructions? Here again, so the task is, as an analyst of argumentation, how do you know whether your rendering of a given argumentation that you're studying is faithful to what happened or not? It's a problem because naturally occurring argumentation is very messy. People do not give you the structure of their argumentation as they perform it, and they leave lots of bits out. So addressees in real time, but also analysts must put in interpretive work to figure out speaker meaning and the way argumentative articulations are performed. Again, understanding discourse comes before being able to evaluate whether one bit of the discourse follows from the other. And pragmatic models of comprehension can ground argumentative analyses. This was done, of course, by pragmatic dialectics, which basically follow deductivistic patterns of reconstruction. The default way of reconstructing argumentation is to take a modus ponens approach or modus tollens approach to discourse, but to infuse it with pragmatic considerations about speaker meaning. That's the complementarity between the logical minimum and the pragmatic optimum, so that basically your reconstruction is faithful to the context of interaction and not just some articulation of formal articulation of propositions in the abstract. The work of Thomas Becker, who's a linguist, who was a linguist, also discussed this in terms of the notion of commitment as informed by pragmatics. But his approach was more towards the philosophy of language, and yet he was interested in finding ways of reconstructing argumentation in a way that was descriptively adequate. And in 2016, I tried to argue that we can use relevance theory to do that, to identify implicit premises. The main idea being that this idea of relevance that I told you before, you can actually use it to make a judgment and legitimize a judgment about which implicit premise would tend to be the one that the speaker intended. It has to do with contextual relevance, with comparing processing effort and cognitive effects of different candidates for the implicit premise, and then finding out the one is more plausible in the context. Now here, interestingly, in that kind of research, argumentation theorists use pragmatics for its methodological advantages. So the field of pragmatic theory offers tools that we can exploit in argumentation. All right, moving on to the normative issue. Yeah, it's a pity that Frank is not here for the Frank evaluation. But pragmatic research has been used also, not just to describe what argumentation is, but to give standards of what good argumentation should be. Again, pragmatic dialectics, because they covered that. They integrate Gricean insights into their so-called communicative principle, which is a reworked cooperative principle, which incorporates something halfway between conversational maxims and felicity conditions of speech acts. So you see, for instance, here that the third condition, you must not perform any speech act that are redundant, has to do with the maximum of quantity. Insincere, probably with the maximum of quality, and so on. So they reframe the maxims as felicity conditions for the successful performance of speech acts in argumentation. And on top of that, in their 10 commandments of the critical discussion, rule number 10 directly echoes Grice's framework because it states that discussants may not use any formulations that are insufficiently clear or confusingly ambiguous, and they may not deliberately misinterpret the other party's formulations. If you take this in Gricean terms, it means you should cooperate in the Gricean sense and make proper use of the maxims. Very interestingly, this is a rule that, if violated, stipulates that the argumentative move that violates it is a fallacy. And so we have a direct bearing of pragmatic theory on a normative issue in argumentation with that rule, okay? So you see how Grayson pragmatics provides normative standards for argumentation theory. In Walton's pragmatic theory of fallacy, you have an account that is grounded on several assumptions of Grice: cooperativeness, context, and presumptions. And crucially, fallacies are defined as conversational arguments which are presented as contributing to the purpose of the conversation, but which instead interfere with it. And so fallacies are construed as uncooperative moves in specific dialogues. And their fallaciousness is also contextually bound because it depends on the purpose of the talk exchange in which you are engaged. What is admissible in negotiation might not be in a critical discussion, okay? So again, the architecture here of Grice's framework is used to provide normative standards of argumentation. And so I've already discussed this a bit with pragmatic dialectics and the linguistic normative model of argumentation of Bermejo-Luque. But of course, the normativity of felicity conditions can be used to evaluate argumentative practices. But interestingly now, very contemporary research in speech act theory has a lot to offer in that respect. And I'm here referring to all this new work on speech acts. There's a 2018 volume edited by Fogel and Harris and Moss, I think, where you have a lot of work that is relevant to this. where a variety of norms pertaining to the uttering of speech acts affect not only comprehension, but also interaction. I'm thinking of permissibility norms as per McGowan, or norms of equality, also the work of Spisa. All these things, they go beyond argumentation, but they are very relevant to it because, well, actually, this is one of the things that the cost action in which many of us are involved is looking at in one of the working groups. But if you think of permissibility norms, so when you insult someone publicly, that generates a kind of a feeling that it's okay to do that. Okay, so if you insult someone for their race, sex, gender, whatever, then it makes it okay, and it's not questioned or denounced, then it makes it acceptable in that practice. And if you think of deliberative democracy, where it should be the case that all participants presumably enjoy the same level of credit, well, having their image stained by this and in a way that becomes acceptable makes them less worthy of public speech than other participants, and that in deliberative democracy is unacceptable. Okay, so that's a very simple example of how something that happens at the level of language has consequences on social interaction and argumentation proper. Okay, so small interlude now, and we can do this online. We can put music, so let's just take advantage of it, because I'm not sure I would have done that if I were in Lisbon in the Avenida de Berna with you guys, if you are still there. So where to now? Okay. It's quite clear that argumentation and the argumentative landscape is heavily infused with pragmatic research at the theoretical level, at the methodological level. So more than an ancillary role, pragmatics plays a fundamental role in the study of argumentation. And I'm going to stop Bach now. Actually, it was Maisky playing Bach. All approaches that I reviewed so far take input from pragmatic research to inform properly argumentative research questions. So the direction of fit, so to speak, is from pragmatics to argumentation. So what next? Well, there are two main questions that seem relevant. Can argumentation theory inform pragmatic research? Wink, wink, Fabrizio. So from argumentation to pragmatics. And are there recent developments in pragmatics that argumentation theory has not yet systematically implemented? And you would guess my answer, of course. So how can argumentation theory be harnessed to inform pragmatic research? Here are two examples. One is Cornelia Ilie's account, Pragma-rhetorical account of political discourse. She is, in that paper, she performs a rhetorical perspectivization of pragmatic analysis and a pragmatic systematization of rhetorical inquiry. So she's really cross-fertilizing, she's mating both disciplines and coming with a child that is used to account for political discourse. So she's really drawing from both disciplines for another purpose, which is quite specific, political discourse. But the idea is that these two fields of research, pragmatics and rhetoric, can merge in discourse analysis to help solving questions related to genre, to the way political interactions or other types of interactions unfold in the public sphere, and so on. And the second account that I want to mention here is the account of Macagno and Walton of implicit meaning, because it's a very interesting twist of the direction. Their 2013 paper shows an inquiry into the very nature of pragmatic inference. So they're concerned with really with meaning and with presumptions also. And what they do to talk about that, that is, they try to assess the inferential integration between reasoning, so something that is more likely relatable to argumentation, and figuring out meaning, pragmatics. So they use argumentation schemes in dialectical frameworks to show that you can think of implicatures, so the traditional implicit level of meaning defined by Grice, as implicit arguments. Specifically, implicatures are triggered by conflicts of dialogical and epistemic presumptions that are resolved by a process of best explanation, which matches a classical description of implicatures as being an inference to the best explanation. And that, crucially, may unfold according to different argumentation schemes. So here we have, a model in which the direction of research goes the other way around. So research in argumentation is directly used to inform research in pragmatics. Okay. And those are, for now, because it's a work in progress, but those are the only two, well, not true, but the most salient accounts that I could find where argumentation is used to talk about pragmatics. The other ones that I didn't mention here have to do probably with this school of thought, the French school of thought of argumentation in language, the work of Oswald and Jean-Claude Anscombre and their followers, where argumentativity is embedded in language. Even though it becomes semantic, people tend to call it integrated pragmatics. So I haven't spoken about this here, but I still have to assess that. I also still have to assess, because I haven't finished reading it, the recent work of Martin Hinton, who's interested in language and argumentation, but language in the semantic side. And I'm talking about pragmatics, so sorry, Martin. Okay. Finally, the explanatory issue. There is a lot of potential to study argumentation from an experimental perspective. So I put research avenues, but I really believe that there are research boulevards to explore in experimental paradigms. There is some already, of course, and you've had, I guess, was it for Christmas or before Christmas, you had Jos Hornix, who came to talk to you, I think. And his research is devoted to issues of argument quality, cultural variation, argument schemes, and he studied persuasiveness as mediated by cultural and personal factors, argumentative resources of people, and for that he adopts an experimental approach. And I think this is really interesting because he adopts a naturalistic take on argumentative practices. He wants to explore how people manage argumentation in their argumentative practices. Another famous study was the pragmatical study of reasonableness in argumentation from an experimental perspective. I'm referring to Van Emeren, Garson, and Murphy's book. But they were out to basically validate the pragmatical model. So they made experiments to assess whether participants judged the reasonableness or unreasonableness of fallacies according to the pragmatical model. So this particular case of experimental research was designed to validate theoretical claims, which is also something that we can do. One very simple example of something we can do in argumentation, in experimental argumentation, in that vein, would be to take, okay, we have, in pragmatics, for instance, we have three kinds of ad hominem fallacies. There's three variants. There's the tu quoque, the circumstantial, and the abusive. Well, do people feel that these are three different categories? And you build an experiment that will inform you whether lay people, naive people who are not trained in argumentation theory actually make a difference between these different types of ad hominem arguments. That's something that could be easily done. And it provides valuable evidence with respect to the theory. Okay. Now, what about, and here I come, experimental studies of linguistic and pragmatic aspects of persuasiveness, because that's, I mean, I was trained as a linguist, as a pragmatician, but I only came to argumentation theory during my PhD. And so I always had a linguistic and pragmatic outlook on argumentative practices. And today I'm going to talk about the rhetorical component of logos by looking at the impact of different formulations. Okay. Now, how am I doing with time? Do I have like 10 more minutes? Is that okay? Dima?
Yes, it's very okay.
Okay, thanks. For the past, wait, I have to make calculations. I didn't do math, I did humanities. 20 years or so, a bit less. There's this new field of experimental pragmatics that was originated by Dan Sperber and in collaboration with Ira Novak, which is a research field focused on meaning and language comprehension in context. You have here the founding book, and then that was published in 2004, I think, and then the 2018 one by Ira Novick. This also turned, I mean, I'm saying it's a field now because it turned into a series of conferences, not only in one country, but across Europe, the Prague conferences that many of you know, of course. So it seems like it's here to stay. The idea is that different experimental methodologies that are available in cognitive science, psycholinguistics, cognitive psychology can be used to talk about and investigate meaning and language comprehension. So methodologies such as reading times, which are indicative of ease of processing, EEGs, which inform you of how words are integrated in sentences and how they're, by measuring electrical impulses of the brain, fMRI, activation of firing up of brain areas, eye tracking, which looks at where you fixate your gaze when you read a sentence, for instance, questionnaires and so on. All these methods can be used to talk about meaning. And so far, experimental pragmatics has focused on trying to assess where the limit between semantics and pragmatics lies, implicature, metaphor, irony, reference, conditionals, theory of mind, negation, and so on. So properly linguistic and pragmatic phenomena. But these can be exploited to tackle issues that are relevant to argumentation theory as well. And in fact, many recent studies have started to look at deceptive cases of communication. I'm not saying that this is argumentation, but we're getting close. So the work of Diana Mazzarella on how committed you think people are based on the nature of the meaning that they conveyed, whether it's presupposed, asserted, or implied. There's a study by Franke et al. On misleading as well and deception. Weissman and Terkurafi investigate the status of lies with lay audiences, and so on. And now this is a field that is rapidly developing. And my take on it to harness that for the purposes of argumentation theory rests on four basic assumptions. First, as I said before, pragmatic inference and argumentative inference are, of course, related. Second, that's also something I mentioned before, persuasion can be characterized as a cognitive state resulting from specific constraints on the management of information as inferences in communication are performed. And for that, we can use relevance theory because it stipulates conditions under which information gets selected during an inferential processing. So information that is easy to process and that yields significant cognitive effects is more likely to be retained than information which is difficult to process and which doesn't yield clear cognitive effects. I have discussed this for fallacies. Fallacious argumentation does that kind of constraining so that critical information is rendered irrelevant. So all the fallacy-friendly contents, they're easy to process and they yield lots of cognitive effects, but the critical information that you would need to defeat the fallacy, that's backgrounded by being turned irrelevant. I don't have time to go into the details, but this is actually just using Hamblin's definition of the standard treatment of fallacies, not to define what a fallacy is, but to explain what a fallacy does. Okay, you can read about it in the paper. If you need it, if you can't find it, write me and I will gladly send it to you. And finally, the third assumption is that linguistic resources are likely to impact the persuasiveness of messages. This is an old rhetorical assumption or dogma, if you want. But now we have experimental methodologies to actually ground that dogma in experimental evidence. Okay. As a case in point, I want to talk about the straw man fallacy, on which I've been working for a while, and well, lots of people have been working on that anyway. I'm taking a definition, and well, why not take the one that is in the paper that I have with Martin? Why not? The straw man fallacy is a fallacy of argumentative criticism, in which an opponent misrepresents a proponent's standpoint or arguments in such a way that they become easier to refute, and then attacks the misrepresented position as if it were the one defended by the proponent. In a nutshell, the form of the fallacy is various kinds of misrepresentation and the function is refutational. Okay. So in one word, a strawman fallacy has to do with misrepresentation. And misrepresentation is an attribution of meaning. Okay. The problem in the strawman fallacy is that it's presented as a faithful representation, but it's not. It violates many standards of argumentation. I'll go quickly over this because you know it. But the problem is that when you do that, your argument may become deceptive and manipulative, because if your addressee fails to spot the misrepresentation, they might accept a fallacious argument. So how can we study that experimentally? By looking at the importance of language. Because it's a fallacy of misrepresentation, it means that there are different ways of performing misrepresentation. So this is based on the idea that different forms, linguistic forms, lead to different presentations. You're all familiar with the euphemistic literature, you know, collateral damage means civilian death, but so it refers to the same reality, but trigger different representations with an ideological impact. For the straw man, whether the misrepresentation is spotted or not is likely to be affected by how it's formulated. So misrepresentations, for instance, that are very close to the original claim might fool the addressees because they might not spot the difference. Some reported speech prefaces may be more suited than others to obfuscate the straw man. Quantification, you know, some, most, many, all can also play a role in that sense. In any case, any way of reporting someone's words is likely or makes it possible to misrepresent what they have said. So based on this, we expect the strawman fallacy to be persuasive when it's not spotted as a misrepresentation. So the research question is, how can misrepresentations be made less obvious? And this is what we tried to study with Jennifer Schumann and Sandrine Zuffray at the University of Bern in our 2019 paper. We tested first the locus of the strawman fallacy to see whether strawmanning an argument is more persuasive than strawmanning a standpoint. Based on that, we tested whether the use of attributed connectives to introduce the strawman plays a role. And in a third experiment, we tested whether similarity, linguistic similarity between the strawman and the original claim plays a role. So the experimental design we took for these three experiments is the same. We constructed 40 small argumentative dialogues with 2 turns in each dialogue. In the first turn, Barbara utters a standpoint supported by an argument. That's a turn that remained constant across all conditions. And in turn 2, Alex, the interlocutor, responds with a claim that represents a possible consequence of what Barbara says, that is supported by a misrepresentation of or a representation of something Barbara said. And that's the turn that varied across conditions. We measured the following things. These are the questions that we asked participants. Do you think the conclusion reached by Alex is proportionate to what Barbara said? If they say yes, it means they did not see that it was a straw man. Yeah. Do you think the conclusion reached by Alex follows from what Barbara said? That makes them think that it's a good argument, and presumably that they also fail to spot the straw man. Do you agree with Alex? Was it effective in persuading you? And the control question was, do you agree with Barbara? Because if they say yes, then we know that prior belief was driving their answers and not that. So first experiment, I'm going to go quickly. I'm just going to give you one example so you see what we're manipulating. Now, there's a couple of reasons why we went for that. First is that if you look at pragmatic dialectics, the violation of the relevance rule, that's rule number 3 or 4, I don't remember, it targets arguments, but not standpoints, or the other way around. So we thought maybe we should check whether there's a difference if you strawman arguments or if you strawman standpoints. In fact, in the very first items that we were designing, we didn't make a difference. And then we looked at them again and we thought, wait, this is not the same. So we separated things to be more clear. So we had 2 conditions, fallacious versus non-fallacious, and whether the strawman is on the argument or on the standpoint. So Barbara says something like, it's crucial to better support young parents because having kids means a lot of financial charges. Standpoint, argument. The fallacious argument condition was a consequence of what she said. So if that's the case, then let's raise family allowances since it's only about the money. It's only about the money is a straw man of having kids means a lot of financial charges. It exaggerates it, right? The non-fallacious rendering of the same thing would be a paraphrase of this. Let's raise family allowances since parents are under economic pressure, which is equivalent to having kids means a lot of financial charges. Yeah. Fallacious standpoint condition, we take a consequence of the standpoint. It's crucial to better support young parents. So we should better distribute government's money. Since families do not know how to cope by themselves, that would be a fallacious rendering of it's crucial to better support young parents. And a non-fallacious rendering of this would be we should better distribute government money since families must be helped. So we asked all the 4 questions based on this kind of item. And we basically got one result across all the experiments we did is that usually people are better at spotting, are preferring non-fallacious arguments to fallacious ones. But when we look at the results on fallacious arguments, we saw that participants rated straw men on the argument as more persuasive than straw men on standpoints. Okay. And so we have evidence, experimental evidence, that straw man fallacies work better. That is, they're likely less likely to be detected as fallacies when they target an argument. Second experiment was about puisque. So puisque is a connective that introduces a cause or a reason, but it's attributive, meaning that it means something like since. When you say, well, Martin, you tell me how it is since you're so smart, that since introduces the fact that you're so smart is attributed to Martin because he behaved in a way that suggested that he thought he was smart. And so when you use puisque, not only are you instructed to take what follows as a reason for what precedes it, but you're also instructed to attribute it to someone. It's not new information, it's information that should have been mentioned somehow before. Okay, so does it make a difference? We did the same kind of manipulation, always on the argument, and we contrasted conditions where there is no connectives and a condition where there is an attributive connective. The results are that when you look at fallacious arguments, the straw man fallacy is more accepted when it's not introduced by puisque than when, of course, all this was in French, right? Sorry, I forgot to mention this, than when it was. But there are plans of doing it in other languages too. So presumably, because puisque is an attributive connective, it alerted participants to the need to check that what the connective introduced needed to be verified as what Barbara said. So basically, it's a signpost, a neon signpost that says, this is something you should attribute to Barbara. And therefore, that's an indication that you might need to check. And finally, similarity, we compared cases where we only change one lexeme, financial charges, financial ruin, to cases in which we paraphrased the thing. So having kids means a lot of financial charges, it's only about the money. And so that was a fallacious condition, and a non-fallacious condition, financial weight is taken to be similar to financial charges. Okay. And the results weren't that clear. We only saw a tendency. We need to replicate that and look into it a bit more. But the tendency was that straw men that are similar in wording, but one lexeme to the original claim are more likely to be persuasive than the others. So bottom line is, if you're speaking French and you wish to get away with strawmanning your opponent in an argumentative discussion, you should always strawman an argument and not a standpoint. You should not introduce your strawman fallacy with puisque. And you should make sure that your strawman is very similar in form. That was the Beatles, by the way, not the French Marseillaise. Okay. I'm going to conclude. This was just an example of the kind of research we can do to bring more meat to the explanatory virtues of argumentation theory. We can actually pinpoint specific phenomena that seem to be playing a role in how people react to arguments. And in this case, it was persuasiveness. Right now, I'm involved in a number of projects. One that has to do with implicit meaning in argumentation. The idea is, do different types of implicit meaning lead to different types of rhetorical effects? That's the project I'm conducting with my PhD student Danielle. I have an MA student who's working on the shifting the burden of proof, and interestingly, she's comparing whether shifting the burden of proof by performing a question is different from shifting the burden of proof by performing an assertion. Whether asking it the question or asserting something allows you to better shift the burden of proof, and that's related to constraint. Yeah.
Sorry to interrupt you, but this is just to say that if we want to leave the proper space for the discussion,
I should stop. Okay, just showing people I'm working with and telling you that I think there's a lot of future in experimental research in argumentation. Thank you very much. Sorry.
This was super clear. Thank you. So thank you so much.
We Swiss people do not mess with time.
Thank you so much for this very rich talk. So if you would like to ask a question, please raise your virtual hand. And for those who are following us on Facebook, you can leave a comment and we will read your question. So perhaps, Steve, you can stop sharing your screen. Thank you. So, okay. I cannot see any question.
Pedro was raising his hand. No? Oh no, sorry, then my bad. Oh.
So Eric.
Yeah, so just a remark, I don't have a button for raising the hand in the participants list. That's weird. But okay, so
it's on the reactions now.
Okay, so it changed. Okay. That's good to know. So okay, so I'm still so I thank you very much for this talk. It was a really, really great overview, really interesting to me. I don't have any substantial point or critique, just maybe one small remark. I think there is quite generally a great danger when you take instruments from pragmatics to the evaluation of justifications, evaluation of arguments. I think that the danger is really that no matter how you put it and no matter what your background is, somehow justifications must have something to do with truth conduciveness. Mm-hmm. So even in if you take into account all the other conditions, still in the end, the quality of the justification will have something to do with whether the method used is broadly conceived truth conducive. So if the conditions for understanding, as you mentioned in the beginning, we have to first understand each other, and then we can evaluate or take into account the actual argument that we have somehow understood. So and I think that's a great danger. Like in the example of pragma dialectics, for example, I didn't understand how that works in their theory. Like if in Gricean theory, if you have a violation of the maximes, or you have some uncooperative behavior, well, that can lead to suboptimal communication or communication failure on the one hand. Then there is no understanding in the first place, or it can lead to some kind of rational reconstruction and reinterpretation, right? But in both cases, it's hard to see how this could lead to some, to some evaluation in the sense of being able to attribute a fallacy. I mean, it's clear that somebody can say, utter or argue very well, but for various reasons, he violates the Gricean maxims, and he's not. The communication fails. So I think these two need to be really kept apart. That's just a small remark.
I see what you mean. Probably it also has to do with the researcher's own construal of what argumentation is. From what you say, looking at truth conditions and preserving truth from premises to conclusions, that is a very epistemic conception of argumentation, which is great. But I think that pragma dialectics was in a different business that construes argumentation as a practice in a dialectical framework with moves that are regulated by certain norms. And so what makes it different and also, I guess, interesting is that fallacies are no longer just issues of how the truth is carried over from the premises to the conclusion, but it also has to do with how people conduct themselves in argumentations.
Yeah, sure. I mean, that is all granted, no longer just. But what I'm saying is you cannot, it sometimes looks as if the aspect of truth conducive okay, goes away entirely.
Yeah, sure,
so that's the problem.
No, I guess that
it's just a danger that should be kept in mind.
No, of course, I agree with you. There needs to be some sort of measure of what constitutes good justification in there. It's just that argumentation becomes much more complex, and as a consequence, ways of being fallacious are also, there are other new ways of being fallacious. I guess that's what they had in mind. But I agree with you. We have to keep in mind that the justification is at the core of argumentation.
Well, and my point was that if there's a failure of understanding, then that cannot pertain to the evaluation of the argument. That's what I meant. So this confusion needs to be avoided.
Okay. Yeah. Thanks.
Now we have Jean.
Thanks, Steve, for a very useful, comprehensive overview. I'm hoping that this talk is going to be online so we can use it as a kind of encyclopedia article in the future.
There is a larger project in the making, yes.
Cool. I think I want to follow up on the previous question from a slightly different angle, which is when you were laying out the three things that pragmatics can do, the descriptive, the normative, and the explanatory. The descriptive and normative were pretty closely tied.
Yeah.
But then the explanatory went off in the experimental direction with a very different kind of evidence, a very different kind of theorizing.
Yeah.
And I mean, I don't want to diss the experiments. I think they're great, particularly now that there's an increased level of sophistication than just showing people arguments and asking them whether they're good or something like that. So, and that kind of experimental evidence totally needs to be absorbed into argumentation studies more generally. I mean, we can't proceed as if that didn't exist. However, I would like to encourage you to think more closely about the linkage, particularly between the normative project and the explanatory project. Because if those two, this is kind of that's why this is a follow-up to the previous question. If those two things become separate, then let's say I mean, I always imagine the classroom context, then we're telling people, here's how you ought to argue, but here's what really works. Or here's what really works, but just be aware that you know what I mean? It's just the normative project then becomes a bunch of preachiness, and the empirical project tells you what's really happening in the world.
Yeah, I guess the big obstacle for that is the existence of people.
No. You see, that's why I want to encourage you. To me, the central thrust of Fred Kaufeld's work actually is to link the normative and the empirical, because it shows that how we can use background norms and practices, which are highly normative, to encourage people to act and reason better. So that by looking at that's his concept. I mean, I don't think he ever said it in a published work quite this explicitly, but in conversation, he would talk about it as the normative terrain. In the course of any conversation, I've taken some commitments, you've taken some commitments, you know, we're developing a normative relationship. And then we can exploit that with each other, and kind of force people to be more cooperative. So not take cooperation as a given, but as a construct within the conversation itself. So that there's a way to use normative. If we can get really good at the norms, those become part of the explanation of effectiveness.
So I have a tendency to compartmentalize according to the question I'm asking. And so what I presented today in the experimental bit had to do with what makes a strawman effective based on some manipulations in terms of language or position of the strawman and so on. And so indeed, that kind of gives the idea that it's a separate component from the inquiry into argumentation. And then there's the question of whether something that is persuasive is normatively good, which is not the same question as should something that is persuasive be normatively good. And what I said when I said before, the obstacle to this is people, I meant, of course, the increasing polarization of public debate, online debate, that doesn't really give you great conditions to try to reach that. But we were thinking recently in talks that we had over the next experiments that we could combine these things in the sense that finding an argument good should in principle also mean that you, so persuasive, mean that you find it normatively good. So that's something definitely that we can combine in the measures that we see. So we can actually ask people whether they are convinced by it and whether they think it's persuasive, because that's not the same question. My guess is that if you remain very vague, people will merge the two. Because I'm not sure that lay people make a very clear distinction between what is normatively good and what is persuasive. So if asking them, this is a good argument, would be probably too vague, and we need to work out measures that will indicate something a bit more precise. But I agree with you, finding out how people react to these things, both in terms of persuasiveness and both in terms of normativity, can then inform further practices or designs that can actually make argumentation be great again. Sorry, but you know, that can encourage better deliberative practices for sure. This is actually what working group 3 in the cost action apply is busy with, trying to come up with designs that would be conducive to better argumentative practices. Yeah, thank you. But you're right, I need to assess a bit more this link between normative issues and explanatory issues. Thank you.
So we have 3 more questions by now. Martin.
Hi, Steve. So I have a question that, that I have opinions about, but I'd like to ask you what you think about it. So you provoked us in a way, and I guess that was part of Eric's question, but also of mine, this principle, first understanding, then disagreement. And you said explicitly that this kind of pragmatic inference leading to comprehension is an input into argumentation. So it's a one-way street. And then, as you would know from other conversations, I would think that perhaps there is an input of argumentation to understanding. I mean, that of course it's a classic Socratic idea, Platonic Socratic idea. And then in your examples, you know, so also that relates the whole Stroman, that also relates to broader issues in the pedagogy of language, like, you know, reported speech. I mean, mention, use, distinction, you understand. So if I say, you know, I don't know, Sally's, this example from Dorn Hawthorne that Sally liked the salad, you know, and Sally, but she has a different concept of salad than I have, you understand. Well, it's just, so then it's really, I'm not strawmanning, I'm just trying to get at the meaning, if only because you use a certain term or you understand. So I say, what do you mean by salad? I mean, fruits are not salads, you know, fruits with whatever.
Okay, yeah, so arguing about meaning.
Yeah, so you have this, so it's not a one-way street. So then argumentation, again, that would be something back to pragmatics, that there is the whole wealth of things that you can do.
So you're talking about metalinguistic negotiations, right? So arguing about what the meaning of one is saying is, yeah?
Yeah, it's one way of doing it. But here, metalinguistic also has a very specific meaning where the speakers know what they're talking about, but they just disagree in a normative sense that, you know, women should not be understood this way. I mean, I know what you mean, but I still think you're wrong in a normative sense. So it's not so much about misunderstanding, it's about some kind of normative status of a term. But
to get to that, you still need to have an idea of what the speaker conveyed in terms of representation, even if it's being undecided between 2 options. And that would still count as pragmatic inference before you can even discuss its normative vices or values or virtues. No?
Mm-hmm. Well,
if you just focus on the individual, you get a message. If you don't understand it, then you will engage in ways of trying to understand it.
Okay, so imagine, Steve, let's work from a super concrete example of,
Yeah.
let's say, generics. So something that is also a lot discussed. And I say something that, you know, Polish people are drunkards, or they are some kind of Catholic fundamentalists. Okay? That I actually think is true. But imagine that, and you say, what do you mean, Polish people? I mean, so you take me to task by kind of disambiguating the generics here. You know, you mean all people, most people, prototypical Polish people, I don't know, the real Polish people, you know, and so on. So what happens here? So do I understand you? As a respondent, do I understand what you're saying? And then I argue, or do I need to argue to even understand what you're saying in a case like this?
Well, I think that you have a minimal understanding, and if that's not satisfactory enough, then you have to engage in some form of procedure to get rid of the ambiguity and reach that. And that can take the form of a discussion. And then based on that, you argue whether you think it's right or wrong. I mean, I'm not really sure I know.
Okay, so now you're getting to something like a minimal understanding. So what is it?
Sorry?
I mean, so you're getting at something. No, you're getting at something like a minimal understanding. So what is it? What is the minimal understanding? I mean,
well,
you see.
When my expectations of relevance have been satisfied, and if they haven't, then we can engage in discussion to figure out what you were meaning. But I'm not sure I really understand. I mean, if you agree that something argumentative, as Eric was saying, is relational in the sense that you have to be able to represent as meaningful a relationship between two propositions, say, before you are able to assess that relationship, you need to know the content of the propositions, right? It's in that sense that I say that understanding is prior to evaluating. And even if the example that you said, you cannot work on nothingness. You have to have some representation that you can, well, at least two representations that you can put together to figure out whether one follows from the other, or whether one is antithetical or with the other, or something like that. I'm not sure maybe we need to discuss this more.
Yeah, but it's just that, so I guess it's the process is because you presented it as a kind of one-way street, that first we need to secure understanding, and then I'm in a position to evaluate the quality of argument.
But we can argue about what I meant. That's true too.
Yeah, and it's kind of interwoven. So if I say, you know, Polish people are drunkards because, you know, all my Polish friends look like this, and then if you say, well, I mean, what do you mean? I mean, do you have a representative sample? I don't know, the kind of stupid critical questions that you can have. I mean, but you can also say, well, if you mean, I don't know, Polish people that come to academic conferences. So it's all, in a sense, it comes together with you see what I mean?
This is, I mean, it's not a coincidence that we have these discussions. And that's also because Pragmatics is very unclear about the relationship between understanding and believing. If you look at relevance theory, for instance, cognitive effects are defined in epistemic terms. A cognitive effect is reached when a piece of information adds new information to your cognitive system, allows you to refine or get strengthen old information, or allows you to get rid of old information that turns out to be inaccurate. And these are epistemically formulated. So in a way, they make understanding depending on reaching an effect related to belief. So the same way, I ask you the time and you say it's 13:28, I will believe you, right? So the output of my inference about your meaning is the same as if you had said it's 30:28 and I just looked it up on my watch, right? So the end point, the end effect is the same. The way to reach it is different. And I think that I would say that pragmatics and argumentation have this kind of overlap, not only in the fact that they both talk about inference, but also the fact that their pragmatic research is not really clear about how to distinguish exactly understanding and accepting or believing.
Okay, cool. Thanks.
Grice, please.
Yeah, my point is along the line of Marcin's, because, well, my main point is whether makes any sense to distinguish between pragmatic inferences, as you say, and argumentative inferences. Because I'm just taking any case of interpretation. You know, interpretation is when meaning is defined by when the meaning, there is, let's say, a dispute over the attribution of meaning. So let's take the case, you shall not lie. Well, what does it exactly mean? So in order to establish that there is, for instance, in philosophy of law, and since the beginning of argumentation theory in the scholastic tradition, it is about the arguments that can establish the meaning of this statement. So why do you distinguish? Why do we need to distinguish between the pragmatic inferences and the argumentative ones? Because you take a cognitive perspective on pragmatics, but this is clearly one of the many approaches. Radical pragmatics is much more along the lines of putting the two types of inferences in a close context. And besides, is the other dichotomy you're drawing, this is just a provocation though, whether you need, well, between descriptive and normative. And this is something that puzzles me, because argumentation, in a certain sense, is normative, in a certain sense is descriptive, but mostly is procedural. So since we are not talking about truth, but we are talking about commitments, we should establish a procedure to get to a reconstruction and commitments that is faithful to the interlocutor. So these are just some questions that I want to discuss with you. And
thanks. So for the first question, yeah, I guess that my answer would be to say that Grice and relevance theory are not trying to answer the same question. Many people in experimental pragmatics took Grice as a possible cognitive account of how we process meaning, and they set out to test it by looking at how implicatures are processed, irony, metaphor, and so on. And so the idea was to, and by this I mean the two-step procedure, where, you know, for implicit meaning, you process first what is said, you figure out that there's a problem, and therefore you go to the implicit meaning. If that is the case, we should see delayed response times in processing implicit meaning, because it's more complex than just reaching the implicit meaning right away. And they found, I don't remember now the studies, but I remember reading about that, that in fact there are no such differences, tending to show that implicit meaning is processed not in a two-stage way, but very quickly. Okay, and that would be
Gibbs.
Sorry,
I think Gibbs.
Probably Gibbs, but Novak I think was also involved in that at some point. So the idea is that here we have experimental evidence that tends to validate one framework over another, one theoretical explanation over another. So that would be the reason why I think experimental work can help us in figuring out how things work from a cognitive perspective. Now, Grice was interested in being able to tell, as far as I've read it, under which conditions can we call this content an implicature, and he gives the working out schema and all that. So he wasn't, even though it sounds like a cognitive procedure, I don't think that was his major point. And then people who have taken him seriously and tried experiments on it saw that it wasn't really working like that. And I guess that my entry point into these questions would have to do with trying to select the models that fit best the evidence, the experimental or empirical evidence that we have. The second thing is, now I forgot. Yeah, understanding and accepting and believing to me are different things, because they are meant to fulfill different goals. I don't think that if you ask me what my favorite color is and I tell you green, I really want to convince you that green is my favorite color, the same way in a situation where you ask me, who should we vote for? And I say, I think we should vote for Jean for president. Yeah. In the second case, I think I'm in a situation where I want you to accept that and engage in a relevant behavior. So I'm trying to influence you in a way that serves some interest. In the case where you ask me my favorite color, I think of that as me merely informing you of my favorite color. And for me, these are different things because the intention with which I produce my utterance is different.
Okay, you are looking at intentions. I will simply look at the dialogue games. Because,
yeah, okay,
I mean, it's to me, intention is something that we cannot never.
No, of course not. But
determine.
I mean, we can make assumptions about intentions in communication.
Yeah, but they are indirect, though.
Sorry?
They are indirect. The only direct thing is the type of dialogue you're engaging with. Then you, from there, you assume you can abuse some kind of intention. But it is a step forward. It is, let's say, an invention that you put on the top of the evidence you have.
Yeah, yeah. Well, based on Grice and then relevance theory, it's all about intention recovery anyway. So I don't feel like I'm doing something, non-standard in a way. But
No, it's not that. It's just to see that there are a lot of points in contact. It's simply there are just different angles.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I agree with you.
For instance, for me, is if you have the reconstruction of the reasoning to explain, to account for a meaning, therefore you can account for the reasoning process that happens in your mind, and that's it.
Yeah, but that's reasoning. That's inference. It's not necessarily argumentation. Even though you can use the tools that you use in argumentation, like argument schemes and all that.
You make explicit though. If I have to account and defend the meaning, I use arguments. Why isn't it?
Yeah, but that's
possible
you're
explanation?
Challenged. But I don't think I'm doing that every time you utter something that is to be taken as an implicature. I mean, an explanation, sure, but argumentation, I'm not sure. If I ask you, are you coming with us for lunch? And you said, I've already eaten, classic example. I will reconstruct that, this means no. And there's an explanation for that. But I'm not sure that you were arguing that this should be the explanation.
So now perhaps we can come back to you, Fabrizio, if there is time after Florian and then Dima. So Florian.
Yes, thank you. Thanks for your talk, first of all. And you mentioned persuasion a lot. So I wanted to come back to that concept and first point out that persuasion seems to have two different meanings, right? So you characterize persuasion as a cognitive state and as a process that involves arguments and inferences. But of course, it has a second meaning that exactly doesn't involve inferences and arguments, right?
Yeah.
So poor Sally again, I can ask Sally if she wants to come with me to the theater, and I can use arguments why it's good for her. But I also can just try the same thing without giving arguments and also be successful in Sally having joining me in the theater. I wanted to point that out because first I wanted to ask you, so how do you integrate those both meanings in your theory? And second, to argue for the point that it seems to me that the second meaning that I pointed out is a little bit more important than the other, actually, because so when we go with persuasion that accompanies arguments and inferences, then at some point I need to admit that I'm not persuaded by giving inferences because of persuasion by inference, but exactly because by persuasion without inference, right? When, for example, when we teach children how to use inferences, they are not persuaded to use them because we are persuading them by inferences or arguments, but because they just take it without those inferences in the argument. So yeah, in that context, I want to ask you about the two meanings and how do you evaluate that?
Yeah, I'm never careful enough to make the distinction between conviction and persuasion. But that's because probably I'm interested in different things. That's a very easy way out, and I'm sorry, but I am aware that, you know, there's this distinction between the presence of argumentation and, you know, prompting for inferences based on evidence and reasons and so on. But as I'm interested in the, I guess, the cognitive process that leads to that result. So if I had the time, or, you know, if I had framed my talk in a different way, I would have tried to show you how I would account for successful fallacies, for instance. And in that process, it doesn't really matter whether you're using arguments that will then trigger some sort of inference of a justificatory kind, or other things in your speech that will trigger some inferential work of comprehension, of information selection that is not argumentative, but that has to do with pathos or you know, all the emotional things. So what I'm saying is that the sort of account I'm interested in doesn't need to make that difference in the first place, because it's all about information management and the relative weight of sets of information compared to others. Now, argumentation can steer that and do it in a more systematic way, but you can also do it without arguments. So I guess it's related to what we're discussing before. But I think is that pragmatic inference, so the way you process people's messages and the way you interpret what they say, can already be constrained in different ways. One way, so for instance, you take an argument from authority. You add extra weight to a given statement because it's said to originate for someone who is credible, who is an expert. That, in cognitive terms, makes the statement more relevant because it enjoys a higher epistemic status that you draw from knowing that experts usually know what they talk about and blah, blah, blah. Now, and that would function in argumentation, and that would be a way of making one assumption more relevant so that people keep it. Now, if you look at persuasion, for instance, and you say, I don't know, I would really, really love it if you did that. You know, something like that, that maybe works along the way of making the person feel that you owe them or that you are grateful, you know, so playing on some sort of emotional state. Emotions have been characterized as attention grabbers, and so they are consistent with a number of, to call them somehow, cognitions. That's a term that's used sometimes in cognitive psychology. It doesn't really matter whether that is integrated into an inferential structure of a justificatory kind for it to have a role, that is to make certain sets of information more relevant for you than others. And if those are more relevant for you, then that will constrain the sort of response that you can bring. I could give you an example of a former French candidate to the presidency in France, so Sarkozy, who became president at one point. And in a TV show during the campaign, he was campaigning about the fact that 16-year-olds should be punished just like 18-year-olds. So he was advocating for lowering the legal age at which you could be punished like an adult. And to defend that, at one point, he just talked about a horrible event that happened in Marseille, where some teenagers threw a Molotov cocktail to the bus, and that burned a woman's body. 2/3 of her body were gone, basically. And he looks at the reporter and he says, do you think that for that woman, it makes a difference that the kids were 16 or 18? And that's it. And in fact, with that was really not really an argument. It wasn't phrased as one. It was just, hey, take a look at this. Is this really important? And so he was playing on the emotional side, because it's really striking, because you see the reporter and he's like, he can't say anything. I mean, laws are decided not by how victims feel, but by whole procedures, which can include that, of course, but there's probably medical, psychiatric expertises about what it means to be responsible for your actions. There are probably precedents, there are probably comparisons with other legal systems. Voting a law is not just something you do by looking at a victim's feelings, even if they are relevant and even if it's horrible, right? But when you frame it like that, it makes it difficult for you to oppose it or to come up with critical questions or to, go against it. And so in that sense, you are discouraging further critical inferences by constraining your accessibility to them. Yeah. So in that sense, the same type of model which posits that what is important in conviction or persuasion is what information is selected, kept, and valued applies in both cases. I'm trying to summarize it, but I'm not sure I answer your question. I hope it's satisfactory. Thanks.
Dina, go on.
Thank you so much, Steve, for a really, really interesting and very, very useful overview of what exists and what could exist. And my question is actually about the second part. So at that interesting part with the prelude, you presented two different ways of how argumentation theory can inform pragmatics. And you asked, can we do more?
Yes.
Is there more that we can do to get insights from argumentation to benefit pragmatics? And also, if there is any recent work in pragmatics that needs to be taken into argumentation theory. And my question is a bit about that, because you immediately went to the experimental part. So do you have anything already in that direction?
Experimental part or something else?
No. I mean, the part about how we can inform pragmatics on the basis of insights from argumentation theory. Yeah. And also the second part, which is what is it more in the, because you made it look like there is some that we in our argumentation scholarship, we are not taking into account the latest research in pragmatics. I was curious a little bit more about that as well.
Yeah. So for that last bit, I was pushing forward for the type of experiments that can link formulation of linguistic formulations and effects of argumentation. So that's the direction I'm exploring right now. And so I have this project on implicit meaning in argumentation, which is directly linking pragmatics to argumentation. Then different fallacies as they operate in conspiracy discourse as well, and their different formulations. And I didn't have time to mention finally a project that we submitted with Kasia Budzinska, Marcin Kosowi, and Basha Konat. On rephrase and reformulation. So how you can achieve things in discourse by rephrasing what you say or what others have said. And in this project, we combine experimental methods and computational methods, actually. So that's also an interface that we're trying to explore in that direction. Now, for the other part, how argumentation can feed pragmatics. Well, I think from what I've read that overwhelmingly the direction is from pragmatics to argumentation, except Fabricio's work and then some integrative work which takes both. I guess that for that and then the French tradition which embeds argumentativity into language itself. But but apart from that, I think that in order to find out how to do it better, we should be able to phrase research questions that are more tailored, or to identify research questions that will help us focus on the phenomena that show that kind of direction. And I haven't been able yet to do that. I think that what Fabricio has done on argumentation schemes and how they can actually take part in figuring out implicatures, that's a nice illustration. But then, yeah, and also, for having navigated the two fields in conferences and spoken to pragmaticians and argumentation theorists, from what I saw, the interest is also unidirectional. So of course, pragmaticians acknowledge argumentation, but they do not treat it like we would want them to treat it. So they they are interested in argumentation mostly for its perlocutionary effects, but not so much for the act of justifying that is at the core of every argumentative interaction that we look at as argumentation theorists. There's an interesting website called the Relevance bibliography list, which is maintained by a Spanish researcher called Francisco Yus. So you just Google online relevance bibliography, and you will find that there's a section on argumentation there, but it's quite small related to the other sections that you find. And I think that, yeah. So to give you an example, you're all aware, I guess, of Sperber and Mercier's work on the argumentative theory of reasoning. And they do have some pragmatics in there infused, but it's not fully fledged. And I'm sure that, I mean, Hugo has been touring the argumentative community for a while, for a few years. He went to Windsor, he went everywhere. But I'm not sure that nowadays people in argumentation theory feel that he is doing the same thing as them, right? Even though it's very relevant, yeah, there are differences. So I would say that pragmaticians are still much more interested in communication at large and meaning in particular and how it circulates. And that's a different interest from the one that you have in argumentation theory. But to be fair to argumentation theorists, they have been much more open to pragmatics than the other way around. So that's also why I think there's a difficulty in reaching a balance. So instead of having 2 or 3 slides on the second, and then I don't know 7, 8 slides on the first, then to reach a balance. But yeah.
Thanks.
We need to develop a PR department in our argumentation communities.
Well, I mean, I think it was interesting. That's why I wanted to know if you have ideas. But I think you're right. We need to pose the questions in a different way. And I myself, I don't have an answer. That's why I was hoping that to get some feedback.
I'll keep thinking about it. I'll tell you when I know.
So I don't know if there are other questions. If not, in the meantime, I can drop my question. It's more a curiosity indeed, and it's related to the field of experimental pragmatics and to the issue that many times is posed about the ecological validity of the experiments that have been done, because I'm asking it not as a provocative question, but because when I present the work I'm doing with Francesca Herbas on the persuasive effect of metaphors in argumentation and equivocation fallacy, I always receive this kind of objection. So I'd like to know what you think.
Actually, that made me think that this will be an answer for Dima as well. So when you do experiments, you necessarily have to be a control freak, because you have to avoid as much as possible things that you hadn't factored in interfering with what you observe. So that's why you have to, well, many people doing experiments come up with scenarios that appear to be very abstract, very disconnected from argumentative reality, from what Sally Jackson calls naturally occurring argument. So one way of fighting that while keeping some form of reductionism is to come up with items that actually do follow what argumentative theories tell you about what argumentation is. That is, you have to make it clear for your participants that they're witnessing some sort of disagreement. So all your items have to be an instantiation of disagreement, since disagreement is so much considered to be a necessary condition in most mainstream theories of argumentation. I'm not saying that of all theories, because some people, for instance, in France, consider that disagreement is not needed for argumentation. But if you have it, then you will have people, participants, aware of that. Another way is also to try to make them engage with the material. So if you look at the experiments that Diana Mazzarella did with Hugo Mercier and Robert Reinecke and someone else that I forgot now, Novak, I think, maybe. They presented scenarios where they asked participants to be one of the characters. So you are the boss of a startup company. This happens, blah, blah, blah. This is what participant A says. This is what your other colleague says. Who do you trust? Or something like that. So you make people engage with the data as if there were characters of that. Of course, it's not the same as, recording a spontaneous response, but at least we can hope that it solicits the same sort of cognitive machinery that they would mobilize if they were in that situation. It's not ideal, but it's still better than just, what do you think of this sentence, right? And so that's, to go back to what Dima was saying, I think that really identifying the features of argumentation is a key into designing experiments that become more ecologically valid, because then you have data that you submit to your participants that looks like something that is genuinely argumentative. And then probably also, there's a study on promises and commitment by Francesca Bonalumi and colleagues, where they had videos recorded, and they asked people about, what they would do, or something about who is accountable for something that happened. And since these are scenes that they could witness if they were sitting at the next table at the cafeteria, that also can approximate conditions of ecological validity. I mean, it's difficult because there's a balance to be found between what you can control and what you have to loosen up with in order to be credible. Yeah. I don't know if that answers the question, but that's a promising, I think, way of thinking of how argumentation can inform experimental methods in pragmatics.
Thank you, Steve. I think we don't have other questions, so I use this moment to thank you again, Steve, for your talk.
Thank you very much.
I hope we will be able to have you soon in Lisbon, in person.
And thank you, everybody, for the interesting questions and the discussion. I really enjoyed it. It makes everything worth it now.
Thanks, Steve.
Thank you, everyone, for being here and for your great participation in the discussion, as always. Our next session will be on the 16th of April at 11. Our guest speaker will be Jan Albert van Laar from the University of Groningen. And of course, I hope to see you next time. Have a good weekend for now. Thank you again. Bye.
And a good spring break, everybody.
Bye-bye.